Hello everyone, I'm Professor Geek. Welcome back to the channel and welcome to the pre-show before the book study in which we're going to do some writing lessons, specifically on verbs this time, but we are going to look at a writing sample as well. So hopefully that went okay. So we're going to talk about verbs first. And verbs, everybody, you should know what a verb is if you're a writer. You should know the verbs. And most people know that verbs are the action word. They're the action word. True. But as a writer, remember, you've got these tools in your toolbox. We talked about sentence structures already. So you've got the simple sentence, the complex sentence, the compound sentence, the complex compound. We'll talk about that. But verbs are a big deal. Verbs are obviously a necessary part of any sentence. The general rule of thumb is that you want to use good, strong verbs, strong, active verbs. So we'll talk about that and we'll see some examples as we get into it here. Now, this applies to both creative writing, fiction writing, like the stuff we're going to look at, but we're also going to look at one example of just a nonfiction writing, because I've got that. I tell my students, if you are in college to get a job, it doesn't matter what field you go into, nursing, kinesiology, anything, engineering, whatever, you are going to have to write and those who can write well are going to rise to the top faster, period. But even if you have a job that doesn't require a college degree, I'm sure you still have some writing to do. I mean, I remember a lot of the Joe jobs I had, before I went to college, and there was still some writing involved, still some reports, and stuff like that I had to do. And that's a little kind of thing that will get employers to notice you. It'll just help you, as you go along in life. And verb choice is one of the simplest ways. If you can master this, and it's not hard to do, actually, once you become aware of it. It might take a little bit of practice, but once you become aware of this, it's the simplest thing to do to really kind of make your writing pop a bit more. And that's pretty easy to do. So when it comes to verbs, the weakest type of verb out there is a form of to be. So is, was, been, is, been, was. I'm missing some there. I've got it written down in a second. But those verbs that are just to be, they are the weakest verbs. Sometimes, unless you're really good at diagramming a sentence, you might have a stronger verb in there, but it's in the infinitive class, and it's not the actual verb. The actual verb, it still is. So if you could say something like, he is someone who runs swiftly. Okay. He is someone who runs swiftly. Well, you might say, well, runs is in there. Runs a verb. Well, no, runs isn't the verb of that sentence. Is the verb. He is your subject. Is someone, that's your predicate. That's your verb right there. And then run swiftly, that's just part of the predicate. Run is not the verb in that sentence. So if you had a sentence like, he is someone who runs swiftly, you want to change that to he runs swiftly. Just cut out all the junk. And that's really what it's about when it comes to swifter or more active verbs. It's just a matter of cutting out all the junk in the sentence. You do need to use to be verbs sometimes. You can't get away from using is, was, and such and that at all times. You do need them sometimes, but you want to avoid doing them over the top. So I've got examples here, but if you have any questions as I'm doing these examples, feel free to show them in the chat, and we will look this over. Let me go into professor mode here and do a bit of reading. Let me share my tab here. So I've got this chosen out here. Yep, here we go. Make sure that's coming out okay. I think that's big enough for everybody to read. Okay, so I'm going to read the first side to the left. This is maybe I'll read the right side first, actually. I think I'll read the right. This is the weaker side, in which I'm only using to be verbs, except for one sentence, and I actually call attention to it. But hear how weak the writing sounds with this. It is a fact. So is the verb. It is a fact that few people stop to consider the verbs they use. So stop to consider, that's not the verb there. It is a fact is the verb in that sentence. It is a fact that few people stop to consider the verbs they use. Many are simply proud to know that what a verb is. Are is another to be verb. Many are simply what a verb is, which is no mean feat in today's fragment tweeting climate. But strong active verbs are what cause writing to stand out. It is what causes fiction authors to hook more readers, students to impress more professors who will be less likely to scrutinize an essay's content, and so on. The weakest verbs out there are the ones that express the utterly passive act of existence. To be verbs. Is, are, was, being, been, often hide in the contradictions. Now, I do have a active verb there, right? What is it? It's hide. Contractions, I'm sorry, it's contradictions. To be verbs are, was, being, and been often hide in contradictions. So hide is an active verb. I'm, where, there, only. Only the novices uses these verbs all of the time. So now, again, this only uses as a verb there. See what a breath of fresh air that was. Using them for too long in succession is awkward, but moderation is the key. Now, it might be that you could read that. Now, I was kind of hamming it up a little bit and putting stress on the verbs there. You could read that, and perhaps it doesn't sound necessarily weak to you. Maybe you're not somebody who reads a lot of you probably don't even realize it, but it is something that will wear you out more, because in order to keep the verb to be as the primary verb of the sentence, it requires you to do more mental work. Because if he is someone who runs swiftly, then your brain has to take into account that extra clause. He is someone who runs swiftly. And that's not a big deal in just that one sentence I'm reading there. But if you do that all throughout a paper, trust me, as an English professor, oh my gosh, just done with reading this garbage by the end of it. It wears you out. He runs swiftly. Oh, it's so crisp. We've got that verb, that we can picture that, and it's an active verb. It's great. So let me read the left side now, which is all with active verbs, except for one use of a to be verb. And it's the same sentence, same paragraph, exact same content. Few people stop to consider the verbs they use. Many content themselves. So now few people stop. Stop is a good active verb, even though it's a stop. It's still a halt in action. There's a movement to it, or a halting movement. Few people stop to consider the verbs they use. Many content themselves just knowing what a verb is. No mean feat in today's fragment tweeting climate. But strong active verbs cause writing to stand out. They cause fiction authors to hook more readers, students to impress more professors who will be less likely to scrutinize an essay on. The weakest verbs out there express the passive act of existence. To be verbs, as they are called, include the forms is, are, was, being, and been. They often hide in the contractions I'm, we're, and there. It's impossible to avoid these verbs completely. So there, that contraction, it's, that's it is. I use the is verb. I finally succumbed to one in this sentence. Avoiding them for too long sounds awkward, but the best writing shows moderation. So you can't avoid them all the time. You will run the opposite problem where you just sound awkward for straining not to use them, but you don't want to use very many of them, particularly in your first paragraph, first opening of a short story or a novel or anything like that. You want those active verbs that are going to grip your reader and really draw them in to the action. So if you're interested in that, I can actually place a link to this. Should have had this on hand, but let me awkwardly find it here while we chat. But this is that paragraph in particular is from a blog post that I'd done on my website a while ago. So I've got to scroll way down to meet or to get the right. There it is. It even has as a picture at the top of it. It's got the Schoolhouse Rock on verbs. So I think it says verbs. It's what's happening or what's something like that. I don't know. But I'll drop this link in the chat here. And that's to the blog post in case that paragraph looks useful to you or something you might want to look at later. And in that blog post particularly, I do have the strong version of it, and then I do the weaker version of it. But look at a couple sentences there. The weakest verbs out there express the passive act of existence. Over on the weak side, it says the weakest verbs out there are the ones that express the utterly passive act of existence. That's usually, I find, the default way people write, unless they're actively trying to use strong active verbs. It just, I don't know why, it just comes out is. And it's not the way we talk, though. If you notice that, it's not necessarily the way people talk. In a lot of school papers, I find that people fall into this use of the to be verb because they kind of think it makes them sound smart, which is ironic because it doesn't, but they get into this idea, especially when they fall into the passive use. Passive use of or passive voice, active voice. So passive a passive sentence is one in which the subject is not doing the verb. So if I say, let's see, the party was thrown with success. Well, the party is the subject in that sentence, but the party doesn't do anything. It was thrown. So some unknown entity, some unknown person I haven't named yet threw this party. The party was thrown with success. The relevant subject isn't even there. Now it's a correct sentence grammatically, and there is a place to use passive verbs if you're doing a science report, for example. Science reports, they want the agency to be placed on what happens in the experiment and not the people running the experiment. So the example I always give my students, which some of you in here should appreciate anyway, but you would say something like the chemical X was added to the sugar, spice, and everything nice, and thus the Powerpuff Girls were born. That's how you would write that in a science report or experiment, report like that. So passive voice has its uses, but it's very rare that you want to put it in creative writing, or any kind of informative writing. With exception, I mean, you can have your moment, but I'll find a lot of students will say stuff like, they'll start papers with silly phrases like, "It has long been known that this person or this event is such and such and such and such," or whatever. It's a horrible sentence. It has been known, or well, who knew it? Who's knowing it, and why is that pertinent to what you're trying to say? Just say what you're trying to say. I find that in a lot of informative papers or analytical papers, which is often the same way in a lot of short stories, I find for some writers, depending on what your penchant is in this, at the beginning of a story or a piece of writing in general, there's a lot of throat clearing, which is just you as a writer trying to figure out exactly what you want to say. So oftentimes in revision, I'll go back through and I'll just have to mark out a paragraph or two in the beginning, and people think, "Oh, what do you do?" Especially if it's a page count students are trying to get to, and they think, you just cost me another half page I have to write. It's like, I know, but you don't actually start saying anything until this point right here. Up here, you're just kind of flustering and coughing until you figure out what it is you want to talk about. So that's the that's the idea. Let me check in with the chat here, see if any other. All right, Move to Media still saying I look like a Sith Lord, a Sith Emperor, Valkorian with my glasses. I should get a Revan mask with prescription lenses. Now that would be awesome. I'd never take that off. Matanui's asking, how would one write a straight up evil villain without it seeming cartoonish and stupid? Let me check our time here and see if I got time for a digression. Yeah, I got time for this little digression here before I jump over to Stephen Cruz's sample here, in which we're going to actually look at some more verbs and whatnot. But yeah, so how do you're talking about a villain that truly is evil? I think you're referring to an elemental villain that I talk about sometimes. And yes, you can write elemental villains in very three-dimensional. The key is that not every character in there is elemental, for good or for bad. So, like Joker in the Batman, Joker's an elemental villain when he's written as he should be. I don't know if you're a gamer, Matanui, but if you ever played the game Arkham Origins, it gets a lot of hate, and I don't know why, because that game's actually really great in terms of talking about or showing the archetypal binary between Batman and the Joker. And the Joker's total elemental evil in that you don't know who he is. He's just there to run chaos, and then he meets Batman, who believes in this justice, and he has to combat him, and there are elements of like the Killing Joke and stuff like that and other Batman stories in Arkham Origins, but that's just a good example, So yeah, you can do it as long as your other characters, you can have all the characters elemental. If you're just writing a tale, like for a children's story or just a very archetypal type tale, you could do an elemental or aspirational hero and an elemental villain. That could be done. But it just depends on what you've got going on. It's kind of a bigger topic than that. But that's what I'll brush on it now. We'll talk more about it later in another stream if you want to. We can definitely do that. So, all right, let me get Stephen Cruz. Now, Stephen Cruz gave us the next two paragraphs in his story that we started on last time. So we looked at the two paragraphs of his last time. Opening up, we had this man on the run in the woods at night, and there were dogs chasing him. Get the sense that he's probably running from police, maybe. We don't quite know yet, but we'll look at that and how it works. So I'm going to read his first over here on the left, and then I'll read my revision of it on the right, and I'll talk about some of the changes I made, and it will have to do with some of the verb stuff. So let me read his first. Ray released all tension in his body. Gasping for air, he gave away his position. Yards away, a guttural snarl thundered. Ray quickly drew his revolver and fired 6 rounds towards the monstrous rumble. The beast whimpered as it tumbled back, crashing into the forest. Every instinct told Ray to flee, but the curiosity of his detective nature overtook. He hastily reloaded his revolver and then waited, listening. Gunsmoke dissolved into the ether as Ray cocked the hammer back. A gust of wind passed through, whistling. The sound of leaves rustling whispered. In the shadows that lurked ahead, a gurgling grunt rang out, followed by the sound of claws digging into the earth. Ray aimed his gun, ready to fire at the commotion. When silver eyes pierced through the black abyss, a predatory glare fixed its focus upon Ray. A deep growl raged as silver-candled eyes rose. A monstrous silhouette stood upon its hind legs, towering at 7 feet. Looking with frightened awe, a deep pit uppercutted into Ray's gut as he scanned the creature. The beast cocked its head back and released a piercing howl that shot ice through Ray's veins. The vocal rattled deep into his chest. It echoed into the air like a starter pistol. The hunt had begun. All right, so really great job of increasing the tension and actually putting us into a scene now. So that first opening paragraphs, if you were there and you remember that last write, were really great at setting up mystery and tension. We didn't know what was going on. Poor Ray was caught. He couldn't even breathe because he just made a sound and everything was tense and frozen in the moment. Really set it up. But you can only ramp up tension so much before you have to give release, and release is action. You know, it's the same thing with our bodies, fight or flight. You know, you get that adrenaline, you ratchet up in your system. It's only going to ratchet up in your system so long before you either pass out or you actually move. You fight or flight, you know, something like that. So you need to do that same thing in the writing, and this does perfectly. This is another good section of that to move that ahead. So let's look at how I revised that in terms of writing. Mine's on the right side here. Ray gasped for air, giving away his position. So right away, I combined the 2 first sentences there. I didn't talk about releasing tension in the body because releasing tension in the body is exhaling. That's releasing tension. Gasping for air, that's bringing tension into the body. But I know what he's trying to say because he's been so tensed up with holding his breath, and now he's finally breathing. So that's the bit about tension anyway, because as I remember, that was part in there in the first part anyway, was talking about how tense things were for him. So I just took that out and just said he gasped for air, giving away his position. Let's just move on, you know. Ray gasped for air, giving away his position. A guttural snarl thundered 3 yards away. He drew his revolver and fired 6 rounds toward the monstrous rumble. The beast whimpered, tumbling back into the forest. Most of Ray's instincts pulled at him to flee, but his detective instinct took control. He reloaded his revolver and waited, listening. Gunsmoke dissolved into the ether as he cocked the hammer back again. A gust of wind whistled through the trees. Leaves rustled on the ground. A gurgling grunt rang out in the shadows ahead, followed by claws digging into the earth. Ray readied his gun. Silver eyes peered through the blackness. A deep growl raged as a monstrous silhouette stood upon its hind legs, towering to 7 feet. A deep pit opened in Ray's gut. The beast cocked its head back and released a piercing howl that shot ice through Ray's veins. A scream rattled deep in Ray's chest and echoed into the air like a starter pistol. The hunt had begun. All right, so one of the things I did sentence structure-wise first is I shortened a lot of those sentences, and I took out some of his clauses that were actually getting at some neat poetic descriptions, you know, talking about the silver candled eyes, you know, and stuff like that. I can see that image, and that's pretty cool. But in the course of the prose and of the way it was reading narrative-wise, it just took too long. One of the things, okay, how do you get across a sense of time when you're writing? Well, on the one hand, you can say this only took a few moments. This only took, you know, this quickly, swiftly, you know. These are adverbs. You really want to nix adverbs from your writing toolbox. Very rarely do you want to use them. They're legit. grammatical elements, but they make the sentences clunky. So look, for example, a couple of places I took them out. Let me find them over on the left again. Clear. I know there's at least 2 of them in there, but now, of course, I can't find them. Okay, so look at the top, for example. Yards away on the unedited side over on the left. Yards away, a guttural snarl thundered. Ray quickly drew his revolver and fired 6 rounds towards the monstrous rumble. Okay, well, logically, that's telling us that he quickly pulled it out and shot it. But the time it takes just to throw that extra word quickly in there slows it down. If you take that out and if you shorten the sentence structures and make the narrative time is how long it takes to read the narrative. Real time is how long things actually take in the story. If you, especially in tense moments, action moments, if you can reduce the space between narrative time and real time, then you're really pulling your reader in. So rather than say, yards away, a guttural snarl thundered, Ray quickly drew his revolver and fired 6 rounds toward the monstrous rumble. Instead of that, a guttural snarl thundered 3 yards away. He drew his revolver and fired 6 rounds towards the monstrous rumble. Okay, well, it takes less time to say he drew his revolver and fired 6 rounds. No one's really going to think he did that slowly, especially in the context of that scene. So it flows a little bit better. I did say instead of yards, I put a specific number in there, 3 yards, because readers do latch on to specific numbers and color. Now, you might want to change that. Maybe in mind it's 10 yards away. That's fine. Change it to whatever number you want, Stephen. But I just put an actual number in there because that tends to click readers into it a little bit more. Numbers and colors are good details to bring a reader into your story, imagination-wise, making them picture it. Same thing at the bottom. So a gust of wind. So, and Stephen, he wanted to tell us that there was wind rustling through the trees, and then the leaves were rustling as well, meaning somebody's walking upon them. But it sounded a little bit similar when he talks about wind passing through, whistling, and then the leaves rustling, whispered. Those are really cool poetic lines. The leaves, a whisper of leaves. That's really cool. And in a whistling of wind, you're personifying the wind and everything, and that's cool. But again, in this tense moment, you want to cut the flowery poetic stuff if it means that there's less time between your narrative time and your real time. So a gust of wind whistled through the trees. Leaves rustled on the ground. See these short, simple sentences. Now, I do mix it up with a couple complex sentences, a couple now and then, just so it doesn't sound robotic. But I keep to those simple sentences to ramp the tension up. A gust of wind whistled through the trees. Leaves rustled on the ground. A gurgling grunt rang out in the shadows ahead, followed by claws digging into the earth. Ray readied his gun. Silver eyes peered through the blackness. A deep growl raged as a monstrous silhouette stood upon its hind legs, towering to 7 feet. You don't really even need that towering to 7 feet in there, honestly, but you can keep it in there if you want to get across the exact height of it, A deep pit opened in Ray's gut. Now, I changed this a little bit because you had, looking with frightened awe, a deep pit uppercutted into Ray's gut as he scanned the creature. Now, there is a slight difference in how you have it. You say the pit uppercutted, which is kind of a weird word. It's not, it's kind of making up the verb a little bit, but that means that the pit kind of split up within his gut, I'm guessing. So if that's really important to you to keep that upward image, then you can think of some other way to do it. But it is an awkward extra syllables in there. So I just changed it to a pit opened in Ray's gut because we can feel that. We've all had that sort of pit, when the gut drops and stuff like that. So it just keeps it going a little bit more simple sentence. The beast cocked its head back and released a piercing howl that shot ice through Ray's veins. Now, at the end of this, the passage there, you say the vocal rattled deep into his chest. It echoed into the air like a starter pistol. I wasn't quite sure what you meant there, so I just changed it to what I had it to. But if I'm getting it wrong, feel free to change it to whatever you're actually trying to say. But the vocal rattled deep. I don't know what that vocal was. Is that the vocal of the howl that the beast lets out? Or is that some sort of vocal in Ray's chest at the reaction of seeing this and hearing this howl? That's what I took it as, especially because that last line, I love that last line, the hunt had begun, just as you have it there. That's a great setup into this scene. In the next part of this scene, it gave me a sense of back and forth that the creature howls and then Ray screams as he's shooting or readying his gun or whatever. So that That's how I kind of translated that. But you can change it up if you meant that the rattle was supposed to come from the beast or something instead. You can definitely change that up. So, all right, let's check back in. I think I covered everything there. I covered the verbs and the adverbs. I think we did that